Good morning, church. PowerPoint working? Sweet. So, what is the funniest thing you've ever done while being sleep deprived? I'm sure this lady would not be very happy when she wakes up. Because we tend to do funny things when we're sleep deprived. I'll share a few stories of what I've done myself. So one morning, after I got to bed pretty late, I woke up, thought I'd have some cereal. And so I took out a plate instead of a bowl and started to pour the cereal and almost the milk into the plate instead of the bowl. Another time, my dog ran inside the house, and so I picked him up, but instead of walking back outside, I started to head towards the freezer. Thankfully, the dog didn't get a cold surprise. I woke up eventually. But yeah, we tend to do funny things when we're deprived of sleep, when we're very tired. And I think we can all agree that rest is a very important thing, especially considering how burdensome life can be sometimes. And there are many different kinds of burdens. There are physical burdens, there are emotional burdens, and there are psychological burdens. Even a year can be burdensome, as I think we all found out. 2020 has weighed heavy on all of us, I feel, and it's definitely taken its toll. And I think we're tired of all the craziness, and we just want to rest this year. Hopefully, and we'll keep it in our prayers that it is a bit better than 2020. But life is filled with all kinds of burdens, and we all need rest. Rest from all the craziness. And Jesus talks about a rest in the Bible. But this isn't the kind of rest when you get home from work and you're tired and you sit on the couch and watch Netflix. No, this is a different kind of rest, a deeper spiritual rest. And if we turn to Matthew chapter 11 in our Bibles and read from verse 28 to 30, Jesus describes this kind of rest. I'll read from the Message because I really like this translation. Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. As I shared before, there are many burdens in life, but what Jesus is describing here goes far deeper than any physical or emotional or social or emotional burden. What Jesus is describing here is a deep spiritual burden and weariness that has affected every single person who has ever lived and who is alive today. This crushing burden, this restlessness, is universal in scope. Whether you are rich or poor, slave or free, young or old, Christian or not a Christian, we are all carrying this burden and we are growing weary because of it. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this sounds a pretty intense burden. What kind of burden can be this universal in scope and this crushing to a person? Well, according to Jesus, it's actually religion. Or more accurately, I should say, the burdensome religion of the Scribes and the Pharisees. Now, for anyone who's not familiar with who the Scribes or the Pharisees are, essentially, when Jesus was alive around 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem, these were the religious leaders of the day, of his time. And most commentators would agree that in this text that we just read before, Jesus is not describing some kind of a general burden that we all face in life. He's actually being pretty specific. He's talking about the heavy burden of the scribes and the Pharisees. This is what Jesus has to say about this in Matthew chapter 23. So if you'd like to turn to Matthew chapter 23, I'll be reading from verse 1 to 4, but it will also be on the screen. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it. But do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others. But they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them." Pharisaic religion can be the heaviest burden we have to bear as Christians. The Pharisees, in an attempt to ensure God's law was followed, added even more laws. laws for laws for laws. But in so doing, God's law, as you can imagine, became so heavy that nobody could follow it, not even the Pharisees themselves, as we read before. It became totally overwhelming and unbearable. They had good reason to do this, of course, because a few years prior, all of Israel was actually in Babylon, in captivity, because of the continued wickedness of the people. So in a response, when they came out of that captivity, the Israelites and the leaders said, okay, we need to do something about this. We need to make sure that we never fall into this kind of wickedness again and become another captive of another nation. And so they set out to make sure that they kept the law. But so often in life, we go from one extreme to the next. And I think you'll find that the Pharisees did go to the opposite end of the extreme. Matthew actually gives us an example of this kind of Pharisaism in the next chapter, chapter 12. And in this chapter, he tells a story about how the Pharisees, one Sabbath day, accused Jesus and his disciples of breaking the Sabbath because they were just leisurely strolling through a grain field and the disciples were picking up the heads of grain to eat them. And the Pharisees were not happy about this. Now, this wasn't breaking any law in the Bible, in the Torah. But, get this, it was breaking one of the 39 different rules and regulations that the Pharisees had set up just surrounding the keeping of the Sabbath. So, Jesus not only revealed the error of the Pharisees, but he pointed out their insufficient understanding of the law itself. They were so zealous in wanting to keep the Sabbath that they robbed it of the rest that it stood for. I think, honestly, it would have been far more restful to disregard the Sabbath altogether than to keep it the way the Pharisees were intending it to be kept. And as we probably well know, this way of doing religion is not a way that leads to peace and to rest. And it's the same today. Modern Pharisees, no matter how religious and zealous they are just as restless and burdened as anyone you might meet out there in the world. Even more so, I would say, because they focus so much on the keeping of the law that they lose sight of the love of God and having a relationship with him, which is what the law is all about. But of all the burdens we face, I think many of us can agree that sin is the heaviest of those burdens. Guilt and shame can weigh down on our hearts and can sometimes make life unbelievably unbearable. And if God did not intervene, if he didn't do something, this burden would crush us. Now, sin today in today's culture is a bit of a taboo word. So I think it's only fair that we describe, for anyone who's not familiar with the context or what the word sin is saying. As Christians, I think this is a pretty good explanation of what it is. Basically, sin is a set of actions or beliefs that ultimately work against human flourishing. So anything that goes against human flourishing, anything that goes against human betterment, the betterment of humanity is sin. And with sin comes a burden. For example, if we have done something wrong or we've hurt someone, at the very, very least, it leaves us with a sense of unease. But at the very worst, it can be a burden that eats away at our very souls, deep down inside. You see, because at the heart of Pharisaism, this burdensome religion, is the desperate need to prove yourself worthy. A religion where our behavior is everything, and where we need to earn God's favor by merit. There's a certain standard that we must reach. And if we're honest with ourselves, we all have this feeling deep down inside that we need to prove ourselves, that we are not quite living up. You could say that every person kind of has an archetypal primordial consciousness of the divine law. That's a fancy way of saying that deep down inside, we know what is right. We know that we should be loving, kind. We know that we shouldn't lie and that we should treat people in a way that we want to be treated ourselves. But we know also deep down inside that we aren't living up to that standard. We keep trying and we keep failing, trying to prove ourselves and to reach that standard, but we can't. And we find the constant trying and doing and failing of that unbearably burdensome. So, what do we do? If you're getting tired or in your Christian walk and weary, there is very good news. As Jesus says this, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." A rest from this burden of Pharisaic religion and guilt. A rest from this spiritual weariness that we all face. A rest for our souls. Not a superficial rest. This is a deep spiritual rest. A rest for your soul, your whole being. So, there we go. So, for example, we all know that sleep is important. But if you're not familiar with this, there are actually different stages of sleep that we go through in a night. You can see the different stages on the screen. NREM stands for non-rapid eye movement. And at the very last stage is rapid eye movement. So basically, there are different stages. In each stage, we slowly and surely get into a deeper kind of sleep. Now, it's very important for your energy to get through the day, if you don't want to feel weary and tiresome, that you get this deep sleep, this stage 3 and the stage 4 sleep. Because if we don't get this deeper state of sleep in our regular sleep cycle, we will find ourselves constantly weary and tiresome, lacking in energy throughout the day. And so if we want to get through the day with ease, we need this deeper sleep regularly in our lives. And it's the same with the spiritual life as well. Jesus is saying that in our spiritual life, we have a deep restlessness, a deep sleeplessness. And we are going through our spiritual lives without this deep rest that is so important. And this kind of rest, this deeper spiritual rest, is what Jesus is offering to us here in this verse. So, the only question that remains is, how do we get this rest? Well, if you read the text, you actually notice that there are 3 requirements. There's one, first we have to come to Jesus. Then we have to take off our yoke. And lastly, we have to put on Jesus' yoke. And if we do these 3 things, we will get that rest that we so desperately need. Jesus in this verse is actually quoting from the Old Testament. So he's quoting from the book of Jeremiah in chapter 6 and verse 16, and I'll read it for you. It says this: "This is what the Lord says, stand at the crossroads and look, ask for the ancient path, ask where the good way is and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls." If you or I want this rest, we need to walk that ancient path, that good way, and that good way leads to Jesus. He is the answer to our guilt. He is the answer to this deep restlessness that we all feel. Isaiah puts it like this: "We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Surely he took our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed." When we hurt someone, even if they forgive us, there are still consequences for what we have done. And it's the same with us and God. When we go against God's plan for human flourishing, when we hurt people, there are consequences. And the thing is this: if we had to face those consequences alone, the weight of them would absolutely crush us. But on the cross, as Isaiah beautifully explained, Jesus took on that weight of our sin and guilt so that we could have rest and forgiveness in him. He was crushed by our iniquities so that we could find peace. So, the first step, if you want this deep spiritual rest, is to come to Jesus and to rest in his saving grace. Then we move on to the second step, which is our yoke. We have to take off our yoke. If you read the text carefully, you'll notice that Jesus calls the yoke my yoke, which implies that there is another yoke, our yoke. And if we keep reading the text, we'll find out that we actually have to take off our yoke in order to put on Jesus' yoke. Now, for anyone who is unfamiliar with what a yoke is, you can see it on the screen. It's essentially a beam or a bit of wood that attached itself to 2 animals. It could be cows, it could be horses. And basically, it would make the job a little easier for them. Instead of one animal carrying a load, it would put the weight on two animals. And so it would actually make their load a lot lighter. And this is what a yoke is. This is what the verse is describing. And as I've all shared before, we all have this burden of sin and guilt and burdensome religion. A restlessness because we aren't quite living up to the standard that we know we should be. And we keep trying to deal with our great burdens. And so in an attempt to ease our burdens, to get that rest, we yoke ourselves to something. We yoke ourselves to ease that burden and to relieve that restlessness. And the thing is, what we yoke ourselves to, is usually our true north. That's one thing in life, or multiple things in life, that we just can't live without. That thing that we pin our hopes and dreams on, what we live for. The thing that you look to ease that burden of restlessness and guilt in your life. This is a thing that we yoke ourselves to, and it could be a many number of things. It could be your family, it could be your spouse, it could be money, it could be pleasure, it could be many things. But it's that something in life that you always look to when you just feel that overwhelming sense of restlessness and burden that you just can't get rid of. You yoke yourself to something. But there's a problem with this, and I'll share that with you now. Either what you choose to be yoked with will crush you and run you into the ground, or you will end up destroying the very thing that you yoke yourself to. For example, let's say that what you yoke yourself to is money. If you look to the pursuit of money to ease that restlessness inside, to ease that burden, you could accumulate a lot of wealth, but there's a risk in that. You could find that money could be a very hard taskmaster. In the pursuit of wealth, you could very easily destroy your life and break up your family. Or maybe you obtain a lot of money, but you also run the risk of losing that money as well, and you end up left with nothing. Or maybe you look to pleasure to ease that restlessness, like food and entertainments. There's a risk in that as well. You could either overindulge and eat so much and watch so much that you lose all desire for the pleasures that you looked to in the beginning. Or you could become so lazy and so overweight and unhealthy that you lose your health, maybe even your work and your family life as well. It's not that either money or pleasure or any of these things are necessarily bad. The problem is when we yoke ourselves to these things. When we look to them to ease that restlessness and that burden deep down inside, that's when it becomes a problem. Because, as I said before, anything you yoke yourself to, you will either destroy or it will end up destroying you. So, imagine for a second that you were yoked with a horse. Now, a horse is strong. It's good at pulling weights. I'm sure it sounds kind of reasonable. Okay, if I yoke myself to a horse, that would make this burden on my back a whole lot lighter, right? Well, if you think about it, not really, no. Imagine what it would be like to pull a load with a horse. First of all, horses are very fast. Do you think you could ever keep up with a horse? And even if you tried to keep up with a horse, you'd probably die of exhaustion. Or you might keep up for a while and then find yourself tripping and drag mercilessly behind the horse. Or maybe you stumble and fall and trip up the horse yourself. Either way, it ends in disaster. The point is, we yoke ourselves to these things that we think will help us, but in reality, they actually end up making life so much more burdensome. We look to these horses or these things we yoke ourselves to for help, but they don't give us relief. They only add to our burden. As Bob Dylan once said in his song, "You've got to serve somebody." You've got to serve somebody. It may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you've got to serve somebody. We all yoke ourselves to something, or as Dylan said, we all serve something or someone. Something that will either destroy you and give you a heavier burden than what you had before, or something or someone that will give you rest. So what do? Jesus says, "Come to me and take my yoke upon you. For I am meek and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Jesus offers us his yoke in its place. A a yoke that doesn't lead to weariness and destruction, but a yoke that paradoxically leads to rest and peace. A yoke that frees us from the burden of Pharisaic religion. A rest that regenerates. In exercise, for everyone here who exercises, you know that you have to rest your muscles in order for them to regenerate and grow. And it's the same in our spiritual lives. If we want to find our Christian walks rejuvenating and regenerating, we need that kind of deep spiritual rest that Jesus is offering here. And to do that, we need to put on Jesus' yoke. The yoke of the Pharisees was a burdensome one, filled with endless laws and regulations and a false understanding of the law of God. And nobody, as we read before, not even the Pharisees themselves, could keep up with the standard. But the yoke that Jesus offers does away with the Pharisaic understanding of the law, and it frees us from all the unnecessary burdens that are tied with that. And instead, it only leaves us with God's law of love, which, as John says in 1 John 5:3, is not burdensome. To take up Christ's yoke means to put your deadly doing down. There's an old hymn that I think fits this perfectly. It says, "Cast your deadly doing down at Jesus' feet. In him alone, gloriously complete." When we put on Christ's yoke, we have to put our deadly doing down. We have to put away our restlessness. No longer should we worry about not being good enough or not living up or the constant weariness of failing, because Jesus was good enough, because he succeeded where we failed, and in its place, he gives us his success. We need to stop trying and start trusting in what Jesus has done. But what is the yoke that Jesus speaks of? What is the yoke that he asks us to put on? And what is it for? Well, quite simply, it's discipleship. To look to Jesus, to learn from Jesus, and to walk in his way, to follow his way. This is what it means to put on Christ's yoke, to become a disciple of Jesus. This means we are to learn from his example, to look at his meekness, to look at his humility, to see his gentleness, his loving kindness. It means reading our Bibles to see how Jesus lived the perfect life of self-sacrificing service. But it also means following Jesus' way. A yoke is an instrument of service, as we've seen it before. And if we want that inner peace of rest, we have to work with Jesus, walk in his footsteps. Because when we make God's will our own will, and we use our gifts for the betterment and the blessing of others, we will find that life's burdens actually lighten. I love this verse in Isaiah. "Then when you call, the Lord will answer. Yes, I am here. He will quickly reply. Remove the heavy yoke of oppression. Stop pointing your finger on and spreading vicious rumors. Feed the hungry and help those in trouble. Then your light will shine out from the darkness, and the darkness around you will be as bright as the noon. The Lord will guide you continually, giving you water when you are dry and restoring your strength. You will be like a well-watered garden, like an ever-flowing spring." Ellen White has this to say in Desire of Ages: "Those who accept the one principle of making the service and honor of God supreme will find perplexities vanish and a plain path before their feet." While being a disciple of Jesus is a yoke in a sense, and a yoke we have to bear, it is the only yoke that is light, and the only yoke that strangely leads to more rest and not a burden, a deep spiritual rest. It is a yoke that is tailor-made for you. It's not too heavy, it's not too constraining. But the best part is, and this is really cool, Jesus is in the yoke with us. We're not tied to a wild animal that will run us into the ground mercilessly. We are tied to gentle Jesus. He is right there with us, bearing the load, encouraging us all the way. This is the great thing about Jesus' yoke. He is right there in it with us. So, like a good shepherd goes before his sheep, Jesus doesn't ask us to bear a yoke that he hasn't borne himself. He doesn't do anything that he doesn't ask us to do anything that he himself has not done. Jesus has taken up his yoke while he was in this life. But there's a difference between his yoke and our yoke. His yoke led to an unbearable burden so that our yoke could lead to rest and forgiveness. He followed God's will to the cross so we could follow his will to the Prince of Peace. So in the end, we are left with a choice. Will we choose to take upon this heavy yoke of the Pharisees, a yoke that just adds to our burdens, a yoke that runs us into the ground mercilessly? Or will we choose Jesus' yoke, that yoke that leads to rest and peace and renewal? So once again, if you are weary of Pharisaic religion, if you are tired of the constant effort to prove yourself, of the trying and the doing and the failing, come to Jesus. Become his disciple and take up his yoke. Rest in his saving grace. Stop following the troubled roads of the Pharisees and start following Jesus in your life today and what he has done for us on the cross. And finally, I want to end with this amazing quote by Augustine in his book, The Confessions. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in you. Thank you.